Steak Bites, we delve into the science of meat with the highly esteemed Dr. Ty Lawrence. With a background rooted in agriculture and extensive experience in meat science, Dr. Lawrence brings a wealth of knowledge to our discussion. We'll peel back the layers of labeling to reveal the real story behind your steak, uncovering the complexities and variabilities that impact consumer choices. Whether you're a seasoned meat lover or simply curious about what you're consuming, this episode is packed with insights to help you make informed decisions. Welcome to the show, Dr. Lawrence.
Thank you, Kara. It's my pleasure.
You bet. So I'd like to open the conversation with kind of the meat, I guess, pun intended, of the topic of conversation here, of how, or what are some common misconceptions about beef labeling that a consumer should be aware of?
So the common misconception is that there is a health benefit to the words on the label. In almost all cases, and I'm not sure which case would exclude from this, the label is worded in a way that attracts the consumer to the marketing of that product. For instance, let's take the word Angus. Most people probably think the word Angus on a label technically means that the product came from an Angus animal, when in fact the legal meaning is that the product came from an animal that was one of black hair coat color. And so we don't actually know if any of those individual animals are of Angus. The odds are that many of them actually are of Angus origin. And then in reality, we also know that many others have no Angus in their bloodlines. So it's a marketing term, just like many other terms that you'll see in the consumer space. They're there to attract the consumer to that product, to pick it up, put it in their basket, take it home, and feed their family. And so I think the biggest misconception is that a product is inherently better than another product on the shelf just because it carries a unique marketing term.
Absolutely. Any other kind of hot topic labeling terms that you'd like to dive into?
Well, so, some of the others that come to mind would be products labeled grass finished. And I often get a chuckle when I'm walking in the grocery store aisle. And I typically do go to grocery stores across the country as I travel. And when I see a steak that is beautiful, bright cherry red and extremely pearly white marbling, maybe paper sheet white marbling, and then it's labeled grass finished. And anyone who knows enough about raising animals would know that something's up with that marketing. A truly grass finished animal in most cases would be notably dark colored lean and minimal, if any, excess fat, very, very minimal marbling. And the fat would most commonly be slightly yellow or slightly orange in color from the beta carotene that would have been in the grass that they are claimed to have been eating. The other neat point about this is in 2016, USDA gave up the grass-fed label and stopped trying to regulate it. So you can legally say whatever you want regarding grass finished today or grass fed because there's no legal meaning to it currently. And so, it's a marketing term. Now, if you want to step back and look at the beef industry as a whole, hey, most of the cattle have been fed grass for all but the last 6 to 7 months of their life. So yes, for a period of time, probably the earliest 2/3 of the life of most beef cattle, they were on grass, eating grass as the majority of their diet, but they weren't grass finished in almost all cases. So lots of marketing, and the devil is in the details.
Absolutely. Could you touch on where, say, if we have a truly grass-fed, grass-finished product in this country, where typically would it originate from?
probably from either an East Coast farm or an irrigated farm where you have grass growing year round. Now, in reality, if we have grass growing year round, it's got to be in the southern part of our United States, somewhere that will allow grass to grow in in the environment year round, even under irrigation. I've seen places like this in the southern states. Think Southern California, Arizona. In theory, it could exist in New Mexico, also in the southern portions of Texas and throughout the southeast. That would be plausible, although I'm not sure I know of any place that would be legitimately grass finishing an animal year round.
Sure. So, from a ruminant nutritionist perspective over here, could you touch on the different nuances of when we say grass fed, grass finished? Of course, we think grass, but there's some technicalities in there as far as the stage of the forage that animal was eating. Could you touch on that?
So there again, the devil's in the details, and the words are in marketing. In most cases, I think the modern consumer assumes that the animal was out foraging in a pasture and was attaining the grass themselves, not in confinement. Now, in the reality is, we could remove the forage from the pasture system and put it in a bunk and provide it to them, and then we wouldn't have forage. Technically, we would have roughage. So again, the devil's in the details and into where this forage was removed and how it was provided to the animal. So let's take an old school, quote unquote, John Deere diet. So if I go back in ruminant nutrition to the 1980s, it would have been very common to feed a finishing steer or heifer a diet based in corn, whether it be dry rolled corn or steam flaked corn, and chopped alfalfa. Literally John Deere diet for a red and a green ingredient. And that wasn't uncommon 30 some, 40 some years ago. Today, that would be extremely rare and probably non existent. But then at that point, you could claim this animal was forage finished, roughage finished, grass finished, at least in part. And in reality, you could claim that today. So it wouldn't be uncommon here in the Texas Panhandle to have a diet that included maybe 8% corn stalks. Well, corn is technically a grass. 8% of their diet is this shredded corn stalk. So, in part, absolutely, they are grass or forage finished. So, uh, again, the devil's in the details. How much of the animal's diet does it take to claim grass finished?
To that point, could you touch on we talked about a little bit of it as far as the beta carotene, the color of fat. Could you touch on some of the other meat science characteristics that you would get with, a grain finished steak versus a grass finished or
Absolutely.
forage, please?
So, in feeding an animal, let's say it's literally an animal that is out on grass. So you have uh, in southern Texas, we might have coastal Bermuda, or in the fescue belt of northern Arkansas through Kentucky and Tennessee and northern Georgia, we might have literally a fescue grass growing. So when you have a green lush forage, that green lush forage will be loaded with beta carotene. In the Texas Panhandle, Oklahoma Panhandle, and Southwest Kansas in the winter, uh, hard red winter wheat forage would be the same category. And that forage with a high concentration of beta carotene will transmit into the fat and provide a unique orange and or yellow color. In addition to that, all of those fatty acids in the growing forage are a greater percentage of polyunsaturated fatty acids and a lower percentage of saturated fatty acids. And so the animal, you're feeding a fermentation vat. Technically, you're not feeding the animal itself per se. You would know that being a ruminant nutritionist. And so that fermentation vat is going to biohydrogenate much of the fatty acid profile that's coming into the rumen. However, in a grass finishing system, the resulting fats are still a greater percentage polyunsaturated and less saturated. And so those polyunsaturated fats are more susceptible to oxidation. And when you have a fat oxidize, you would call that rancidity at home. It tastes different. And so some people call it a gamey taste. Some people call it a grassy taste. Others call it a cowy taste. It just has a unique and different flavor profile than beef that was grain finished in totality. So the grain finished beef is more likely to taste buttery, whereas a grass finished beef is more likely to taste a little bit rancid, and if it's well aged, maybe notably more rancid. And so it's simply a difference in the flavor profile. There'll also be a notable difference in the aroma. If I gave you a grass finished steak ribeye and I gave you a grain finished ribeye, you would detect a difference in their odor or in their aroma as they came off the grill, and then you would also detect a notable difference in their flavor profile solely because of the different fatty acids that are being deposited in those different muscles.
So, what about from a nutritional perspective? Let's give our consumer a little bit of insight into that. How much are we going to vary from what they're consuming and putting into their bodies?
Yeah. So from all nutrients other than fat, negligible. The sole difference that you should expect from a grain finished versus a grass finished cut of beef or cut of meat per se is in its fatty acid profile and its fat quantity. By the very nature of feeding an animal a concentrate, high energy diet, they're simply eating more calories than their maintenance energy requirement, and then they're able to deposit those calories as fat. It might be back fat, it might be internal fat, it might be seam fat, or it might be marbling fat, but those excess calories are deposited as fat. In the grass finishing system, an animal would have very little, and in some days, no excess intake beyond its maintenance energy requirement, and it would simply deposit less fat on a daily basis throughout its life and or throughout its consumption of that grass finishing system. But the sheer nutrients, the protein, the zinc, the iron, there are no differences there.
Could you touch on omegas within that setting, Dr. Lawrence? Is that something you'd be comfortable touching on?
So we could talk about omega-6 fatty acids and omega-3 fatty acids. In the grass finishing system, we're going to have a greater proportion of omega-3s, and in a grain finishing system, we're going to have a greater proportion of omega-6s. But again, don't get lost in the weeds. You're not going to eat grass finished beef to improve your omega-3 fatty acid profile. If that's something that you feel you need to do, I would highly recommend you consume cold water fish.
Yes. Yeah, I've definitely had that conversation on a few different settings. Of if omega 3s are what we're after, then a salmon fillet or something should be the protein of choice for that,
Yep.
not
Yep.
necessarily beef. But
Absolutely. I love halibut for omega-3s,
I go.
and I do enjoy grass finished beef, true grass finished beef, and it is technically higher, but it's negligible here.
Sure. So one that's typically comes up as a topic of conversation that I'd like to hear your expert opinion on. The differences, particularly, with a ruminant versus our simple stomached animals, as far as kind of what they consume and then how that translates into their meat comparatively.
Okay. So a simple stomached animal, and we are a great example, and a pig is a great example, literally are what they eat. So, and it mostly comes down to the protein as well as the fat. So if I go eat a bowl of butter, then my body is going to deposit those same fatty acids that were in that butter. In contrast, if I were to give a steer or heifer that same bowl of butter, they will deposit that as a much greater proportion of saturated fatty acids than what I gave them. And that's because in a ruminant animal, we're feeding the fermentation vat, we're not feeding the animal. And the trillions of bacteria, protozoa, fungi, and yeast that are in that fermentation vat, they're going to consume those products, consume that feed stuff, and then they're going to convert it into metabolic outcomes. And so much of the nutrients that a ruminant receives are actually the microorganisms themselves as they pass from the rumen onto the omasum and abomasum and then are absorbed by the small intestine. So there's a sea change of differences between feeding a simple stomached animal and feeding a ruminant.
So to that point of, is there any data of feeding different ingredients to cattle to increase, say, omega 3s or some other monumental change, especially comparatively to like feeding hogs and chickens, some different feed stuffs that can make a change in the meat characteristics?
So there's some research that demonstrates feeding distillers grains, which would be a higher proportion of corn oil, particularly before the ethanol refiners began spinning off the corn oil, that would slightly increase omega 3s in the fat profile. And it would also slightly increase the potential for rancidity and would slightly decrease the shelf life. Notice I use the word slightly in each one of those because the rumen biohydrogenates whatever you put in there. You'll get a slight change. There is some old literature that would suggest if you feed cattle fish oil, which is extremely polyunsaturated, that you can make larger scale changes in omega 3s than feeding distillers grains or grass feeding the animal. However, that would be extremely cost prohibitive and of minimal value nutritionally. Again, if you want to improve your omega 3 profile, I strongly recommend you go eat a cold water fish and not look for grass finished beef as your source of omega 3s.
Sure. So I'd love to switch gears for a quick second. At a high level, could you walk through the process, of an animal, the grading system, especially for an animal to be eligible to be graded prime choice? I'd love for you to touch on that, and then later on, could you touch on aging and how that changes the meat characteristics?
Absolutely. Okay, so at a high level, quality grading comes down to two factors. The first and most important is the marbling that is within the muscle fibers. So when your consumers see their products, they'll notice that there is a range of marbling within muscles. In the grading process, we only look at one muscle in the body and we only look at it at one place. So we look at the ribeye, and we look at that ribeye between the 12th and the 13th ribs of the animal. And if we went to a different muscle, we could easily get a different answer. However, the grading system was only built on that one muscle. And it is intended to represent the entirety of the animal. We things we know about physiology today would say that it represents the animal, and it more than anything, it represents that one muscle the best. So we have levels that we call grades. The highest grade with the most intramuscular fat or marbling is prime. And within that grade of prime, we have 3 levels of marbling. Then we drop down to choice. Within the choice grade, we have 3 levels of marbling. Then we drop down to select. Within that grade, we have one level of marbling. And then below that, we drop down to what's called standard by the grading service, or no roll, also known as ungraded in the marketplace. And so as we go from prime to choice to select to ungraded beef, there's lesser and lesser and lesser intramuscular marbling fat. So that's the single biggest piece of it. There's another piece of it that is maturity. And so that is determined two ways. One of those is by evaluating how many permanent incisors an animal has when it's harvested. And the second way is determining the percentage of ossification of the backbone. So as an animal gets older, particularly physiologically older, its cartilage turns from soft collagen to hard bone. And we subjectively estimate that change in the animal and grade it accordingly. So a younger animal are those that are eligible for prime, choice, select, and ungraded, whereas older animals are eligible for what we call commercial, utility, and cutter canner. And those older animals are what you might think of as a cow. We call them cull cows in the industry, but a cow that has reached the end of her useful life. Maybe she's had 10, 12, 15. Some cows have up to 18 or even 20 calves in their life cycle. When that cow reaches the end of her useful life, she is marketed as a cull animal, and her beef then enters the lean ground beef system. So that's in a nutshell what we have. Marbling, prime is the most, then choice, then select, then ungraded, and maturity, switching from those young grades to commercial, utility, and cutter canner.
So why would we do that, Dr. Lawrence? Why do we have those specs in place?
Well, those grades were originally used to determine how well an animal was finished, again, prime down to ungraded, and how old the animal was. Over time, we've realized that those grades have some palatability prediction. And an animal with prime marbling is more palatable than an animal with choice, and an animal with choice is more palatable than select, and so on and so forth. The primary palatability change that we see in graded animals is in the flavor of the beef. So prime beef has a much more notably rich, buttery flavor than beef that grades choice. And I can say the same choice over select and select over ungraded. So the more intramuscular fat, the more marbling a muscle has, the deeper, richer, beefy flavor we can expect to experience as we eat that cut.
Good. What about aging? How does aging factor into this equation?
Absolutely. So we've learned over the course of about the last 40 years in muscle food science that as we allow meat to age, that the enzyme systems naturally occurring in that meat break down proteins, and that process of breaking down the proteins decreases the resistance that you notice when you're chewing on it. So if I were to harvest an animal today and cut a steak off and give it to you tomorrow, that steak would be notably chewy. And so you cut a piece off and you put it in your mouth and you start to work on it, and there's going to be a lot of resistance to your teeth. And you're going to think, wow, this is a really tough piece of meat. Now, if I took the rest of that cut and I aged it, let's say 35 days, and then I cut a steak off and I cook it the same and I give it to you, you would have a completely different eating experience solely because we allowed the enzymes inherent in the meat to do what they're naturally going to do, which is degrade those individual proteins and decrease the toughness and improve the tenderness of the product. So here at the university, in our meat lab, we commonly let all of our carcasses age a minimum of 35 days because we want those products to leave here being adequately aged to have optimum palatability.
So from that perspective, does that change the nutritional profile of beef when you grade it?
In a word, no. The nutritional profile is what it is. The aging process doesn't improve, nor does it detract from the nutritional profile of the product.
So typically the consideration is water loss primarily within that.
So there is some purge loss that does occur with that, yes. The other thing that can occur and can detract from consumer expectations is the lactic acid bacteria that predominate in an anaerobic environment. So if I sell you a rib roll in a vacuum package, there's no oxygen in there. So there's no aerobic bacteria growing in there, which means that any bacteria have to be growing anaerobically, and that pretty much limits your growth to lactic acid bacteria, which can give a unique odor when you open the bag 2 months later.
Sure. Very interesting. So, from a meat science nutrition perspective, one thing that I'd love for you to touch at kind of a high level for our consumers is from just the sheer meat science, the difference between beef and some of the other proteins that are on the market.
Yeah. So let's talk about beef versus pork and poultry. Those would be the two dominant proteins other than beef in our marketplace. So if we're talking about protein, the differences are typically pretty nil and are a trade-off from fat. So if let's start with poultry. If I had a poultry chicken breast, it's probably no more than 4% fat. I'm assuming a skinless one now, and a pork chop could easily be 4.5, maybe 5% fat, and a ribeye, depending on your quality grade, could get up to 6, 8, 10, 12% fat. So as I add fat, then I take away protein if we're looking at this as a whole in a 100% system. And so there's a trade-off. If I want it to taste good, then I'm going to have less protein per any unit of mass. If I want strict protein and I don't really care what it tastes like, then I'll go eat chicken and get a technically higher percentage of protein. So there is a trade-off between protein and fat. Now, if we're talking just sheer nutrients, there's a advantage of beef and of pork in iron and zinc. If we want to talk about other nutrients, there's technically an advantage to pork for vitamin B1, thiamine. So nothing is black and white and cut and dry. And when it comes to nutrients of any of those three species, they all have trade-offs. And it's I advise the consumer to understand what those trade-offs are.
Sure. Curious, what about the amino acid profile? Do we
So
see differences?
the amino acid profile of muscle is almost identical across all mammalian species. There would be probably 98, 99% conserved amino acid pools. And what that means for the consumer is you're turning over your protein every day. Your biceps femoris has an amino acid profile. Your pectoralis profundi has an amino acid profile, and so on and so forth throughout your body. That amino acid profile is the same in those same muscles in the chicken and in the pig and in the steer. And if you want to get truthful about it, I could eat a horse, I could eat a dog, I could eat a cat, and that amino acid profile in muscle is still the same. The best nutrient source to replenish the amino acid profile of your muscle is to eat another muscle because the amino acids, you're not short an amino acid. There's not a limiting amino acid. You're getting the exact pool and the exact profile at the same ratio that your muscles are already.
Very good. Well, I appreciate you taking a deep dive into the science and having kind of a nuanced conversation around that, particularly in the beef setting. To close out, do you have some final thoughts to share with our consumers and our listeners?
So, if you're curious about a food label, dig into it and find out what it actually means and what it doesn't mean. A good example is something that I get questioned a lot around here, and that's the term all natural. In the marketplace, I'm certain there's at least three different versions of the term all natural in use in the marketplace. For instance, there's the legal version of all natural, and USDA has established that as meaning a product that is minimally processed and has no added ingredients, which is fundamentally most all meat items in the case, as long as it doesn't have, salt, pepper, seasonings, phosphates. It's not a processed meat item. Then most any fresh meat technically meets that label. And then we have some products that are what I call all natural and not recently labeled. And so there's a host of products that are out there that are the label says all natural, and when you read the details, the animal couldn't receive an antibiotic or a growth promoting hormone in the last 120 days. And then there's a different set of labels that in which the all natural label is a product that we would call never ever. And that's an animal that never in the history of its life received an antibiotic or a growth promoting hormone. And it's all marketing. The human nutrition difference, the human food safety difference between all three of those labels is nil. The never ever animal is no more safer for you and your family than the animal that is conventional and came into the slaughterhouse today. So don't get caught up in the marketing. If you want to understand it, dig into it and read it, but realize it's marketing. It's not food safety. It's not human nutrition. It's marketing, and one product trying to differentiate themselves is somehow different, typically better than another product. But again, it's no more than marketing.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate that thought. That's, as far as a company, we like to just have conversations. And I think that becomes even more important every day when we get further away from where our food comes from, is to come back to that and have conversations with the people that are producing your food. So you can be more informed, which to that, we're going to wrap up today's episode and leave you with some additional food for thought. In a world where every choice matters, let's approach consumption with mindful intention. Seek knowledge, engage in conversations, and shape your legacy with purpose. This is Kara Smith, signing off Steak Bites Podcast.